Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I am Eric. We like to build unconventional commander decks and all of that good stuff. Now let's talk about Innistrad Midnight Hunt. And today is a special day. It's everyone's favorite day. It's Simic Day. Wait, hear me out. Don't call in sick just yet, because today we are talking about Slogurk the Overslime. Slogurk is a 3/3 ooze with trample that costs 1 green-blue, and Slogurk has an impressive 3 activated or triggered abilities. First, whenever a land is put into your graveyard from anywhere, you put a +1/+1 counter on Slogurk. Also, you can remove 3 +1/+1 counters from Slogurk to return it to its owner's hand. And finally, when Slogurk leaves the battlefield, return up to 3 target land cards from your graveyard to your hand. So you probably noticed a couple of things right away. First, Slogurk is yet another Simic Lands commander, which is exactly what we all wanted. But Slogurk does lands differently. Slogurk doesn't necessarily want you to just frantically pull all of your lands out of your deck and slam them onto the battlefield as fast as possible, like a madman. In playtesting this deck, I found that Slogurk really likes to have lands moving back and forth between your hand and your library and your graveyard. I ended up sacrificing lands quite a bit, so my land count didn't reach typical absurd Simic levels. Because there's so much reward for sacrificing lands with Slogurk that it was worth it. And again, it's very different than other lands matter commanders. And Slogurk is not just a lands deck enabler, it's also a win condition. If your deck is doing its thing and putting lands into the graveyard, then Slogurk will get really big. And because it has trample, it'll be very possible to threaten a commander damage win. And because Slogurk can bounce itself back to your hand by removing 3 +1/+1 counters from it, it's a refreshingly resilient commander. So I had a lot of fun playing this one. Anyways, Slogurk is still a lands matter commander, so the question is, can we build an effective Slogurk deck without just making another copy-paste Simic landfall deck like AC or Tatyova? And I think we can, but there are some disclaimers. First, I tried to come up with something really unique for Slogurk, but I just ended up realizing that the commander kind of just tells you exactly what it wants to do right on the card. Slogurk isn't super flexible. I've taken my deck here in a bit of a different direction, but it's more of a sub-theme rather than an overall deck strategy. But we'll get to that later. And second, I ended up deciding on a budget Slogurk deck. Because if we don't do that, then we'll need to play things like Hermit Druid because it's so good with Slogurk, and Scapeshift and Crucible of Worlds, because why wouldn't you? And before you know it, you've got a cookie-cutter Slogurk deck. So with that in mind, we're building budget Slogurk. I have 2 budget levels that we'll cover today, one deck with a budget of $50 and one with a budget of $150. As always, you can see the link in the description for both of those deck lists. So let's get into the content of these decks, starting with the most important part, the lands. Now normally I don't spend too much time talking about the lands in my decks, but Slogurk cares about lands, so the lands we choose to include will have a pretty big impact on how the deck plays. We're running 43 lands in this deck, though only 42 of them tap for mana, and only 10 of them are basics, because there are so many juicy non-basics that really synergize with what Slogurk does. First, we'll play all of the cycling lands that we can. Cycling these are an easy way to get a land into your graveyard to trigger Slogurk, and they replace themselves with another card from your deck when you do. I've also run as many fetch lands as are affordable for a budget build, even the bad ones. Again, this just triggers Slogurk to get those +1/+1 counters, since that trigger happens whenever a land goes to your graveyard from anywhere. It doesn't matter, it could be your hand, your library, or from the battlefield. And then we've got a bunch of lands that just like to be sacrificed. These are great because when our commander leaves the battlefield, we can get these lands back to our hand and use them again. Like Tyrite Sanctum, which can give Slogurk more +1/+1 counters, and eventually indestructible. And again, we can reuse it from our graveyard if we need to. We've got Tectonic Edge and Ghost Quarter to destroy your opponent's lands. We've got Memorial to Genius, which lets you pay 4 and a blue and tap it and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. Sure, it enters the battlefield tapped and it only taps for blue, and it basically costs 6 mana and sacrificing the land to draw those cards, but it makes Slogurk happy, so just do it. I also like Lotus Field. This one enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters, you have to sacrifice 2 lands. Now, normally you don't want to do that, but we love sacrificing lands in this deck. And then, Lotus Field taps for 3 mana. And it has hexproof, so it's harder for your opponents to screw you over by killing it after you've sacrificed 2 other lands just to play it. Note that Lotus Field is around $5 right now, which puts it out of the budget range for a $50 deck, so this card is only in the $150 budget version of the deck. There are a few other lands in here that sacrifice for some value as well, but I won't cover all of them here. But I do want to talk about our creature lands. One of our possible win conditions in this deck is turning lands into creatures and beating our opponents to death with them. And if our vulnerable creature lands happen to get killed in combat or something, great, no problem, Slogurk loves it. And Slogurk helps us get those lands back out of the graveyard so they can keep hitting our opponents again and again. Hall of the Giants can turn into a 7/7 with Ward 3 until end of turn. Now this costs 5 and a blue to do it, but it might be worth it. Lair of the Hydra is very flexible. By paying X and green, it becomes an XX Hydra creature until end of turn. This card is also $2 to $3 right now, so I've replaced it with Lumbering Falls for the budget deck, which works just fine, but it's much less exciting. And then for really efficient man lands, we've got Mishra's Factory, which can become a 2/2 for just 1 mana. This is a great chump blocker that feeds Slogurk when it dies. We've got other lands that turn into creatures too, but again, please see the links in the description for the deck lists for more details. But there are also plenty of other ways to turn our lands into creatures. First, there's Waker of the Wilds. This is a 3/3 Merfolk Shaman that costs 2 green. It has pay X green to put X +1/+1 counters on target land you control. That land becomes a 0/0 elemental creature with haste. It's still a land. So this is a really flexible way to animate your lands whenever you want. But if you want them to be big, it'll cost you quite a bit of mana, but it's also a great mana sink if you need one. There's also Nissa, who just really loves to turn lands into creatures, so we'll include several Nissas in this deck. Nissa Vital Force is just an all-around good card. The +1 lets you untap a land you control. Until your next turn, it becomes a 5/5 elemental creature with haste, so you can attack with it or block with it, or just use it as ramp. The -3 lets you return a permanent card from your graveyard to your hand, which is almost always useful. And the -6 gives you an emblem with whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. So that's amazing in any landfall deck, and in our deck because we'll also have many ways to put lots of lands into play, which we'll talk about later. And since Nissa enters the battlefield with 5 loyalty, she can activate her ultimate on your next turn if you use her +1 and then she doesn't take any damage. There's Nissa Who Shakes the World, which was a monster in Standard for a while. It's a 5 mana, 5 loyalty Nissa with a static ability. Whenever you tap a forest for mana, add an additional green. Now we don't have too many forests in this deck, so that isn't that impactful for us. But the +1 lets you put 3 +1/+1 counters on up to 1 target non-creature land you control. You untap it, and it becomes a 0/0 elemental creature with vigilance and haste that's still a land. So that land will permanently be a creature. And again, this is ramp since Nissa is also untapping the land. And that land can attack and block since it has vigilance. And Nissa's ultimate is her -8, which lets you search your library for all of your forests, put them onto the battlefield, and you get an emblem with lands you control have indestructible. Again, we don't have too many forests in this deck, so we won't be ramping a lot with this, but the indestructible is nice. But mostly this Nissa is in the deck for her +1, which will just grow our land army turn after turn. And finally, Nissa Worldwaker is a 5 mana, 3 loyalty Nissa, with a +1 that just permanently turns one of your lands into a 4/4 creature with trample. Which is great, again, this will just slowly grow our land army turn after turn. Nissa Worldwaker has another +1 that might ramp us, again if we have forests, and a -7 that might be useful, but honestly we'll probably never have enough loyalty to use it. Now all of these Nissas are in the $4 to $10 range, so they're quite unplayable in the $50 budget version of this deck. So instead the $50 version has Wakeroot Elemental. This is a 6 mana 5/5 elemental that lets you pay green, that's 5 green, to untap a land you control. It becomes a 5/5 elemental creature with haste. So this effect is permanent, but it's also expensive at 5 mana for each and every land you want to animate. There's also Verdant Touch. This is a 2 mana sorcery with buyback 3, and it has target land become a 2/2 creature permanently. So now we're paying 5 mana for a 2/2, but we don't need to pay the 6 to get started like we do with Wakeroot Elemental, and Verdant Touch will be a lot harder for opponents to stop. Also, Verdant Touch can target your opponent's lands, just in case there's an annoying Maze of Ith or Cabal Coffers or something that you'd like to make really, really fragile and easy to remove. So we have plenty of ways to animate our lands in this deck, which will help attack our opponents or block attacks, and of course, put the lands in the graveyard as they die. But before we stop talking about lands, there's a few really impactful ones that I want to mention. These particular lands are so awesome with Slogurk that I've included a series of land tutors to help find them. First, there's everyone's favorite, Field of the Dead. We'll be making lots of land drops in this deck, more on that later, and we have relatively few basics in our deck, at least for a budget deck, so having 7 unique lands to turn on Field of the Dead will be fairly easy for us. And after that, it's just Value Town as we crank out lots and lots of zombies. Now, unfortunately, Field of the Dead is over $15, so this is definitely not in the $50 budget version of this deck. There's also Glacial Chasm. This one has a cumulative upkeep of pay 2 life, and when it comes into play you sacrifice a land, which we don't mind at all, and creatures you control can't attack. But most importantly, it prevents all damage that would be dealt to you. So Glacial Chasm can be a pretty big hurdle for our opponents to overcome if they want to kill us. And with Slogurk, we can easily just never pay that cumulative upkeep. We'll sacrifice it, let it go to the graveyard, then use Slogurk or some other means to get it back to our hand, and play it again. Just remember to maybe let Glacial Chasm die when you want to attack again. I mean, combat is pretty much the only win condition in this deck, so you will need to attack at some point. But I really want to talk about Drownyard Temple. This land taps for colorless, and you can pay 3 and return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So with any sacrifice outlet for lands, of which we have several, we can just keep sacrificing and recurring Drownyard Temple. And every time we do this, Slogurk gets a +1/+1 counter. We'll trigger any landfall effects that we happen to have, and we can just keep doing this over and over again for 3 mana each time. Drownyard Temple has been amazing for me in my playtesting. And finally, I want to mention Blast Zone. Blast Zone enters the battlefield with a charge counter on it. It taps for colorless, and you can pay XX and tap it to put X charge counters on it. And you can pay 3 and tap it and sacrifice it to destroy each non-land permanent with mana value equal to the number of charge counters on Blast Zone. So as long as we can recur lands from our graveyard, this is repeatable removal, though it is a bit slow since you have to tap it to both put charge counters on it and to activate it to destroy things. It's also a bit chaotic since you'll rarely be able to kill everything you want with just a single activation, much less without taking out something of yours as well. But again, Blast Zone is removal that we can reuse over and over, and it's a land, so it's perfect in this deck. Okay, so we're finally done talking about the lands in this deck. But since we're sending a bunch of lands to the graveyard and recurring them to our hand with Slogurk, we will need some ways to help us make more land drops. Let's talk about that next. Now we will need to be able to make more than 1 land drop per turn, or our mana base will never survive us sacrificing lands all the time. While a higher budget Slogurk deck might play cards like Wayward Swordtooth and Oracle of Maldaya, neither our $50 or our $150 budget limit decks can really afford to play too many of these. So we'll trade quality for quantity. Sakura Tribe Scout and Sky Shroud Ranger cost only a single mana, and they can tap to let you put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. This is perfect for replaying lands that Slogurk has recovered from our graveyard to our hand. For just 2 mana, we'll get even more of these creatures. Llanowar Scout, Scaled Herbalist, Budoka Gardener. These can also let us tap to put a land into play. Budoka Gardener can also flip over into Dokai, Weaver of Life, if you have 10 or more lands. And then you can pay 4 and 2 green and tap it to create an XX Elemental Creature token, where X is the number of lands you control. We'll also play single-use effects that get successively larger, like the Growth Spiral, Eureka Moment, and Urban Evolution series. All of these are instants or sorceries that let us draw 1, 2, or 3 cards and play an additional land. So these are some examples of how we'll make extra land drops. I didn't mention everything in here that gives us additional land drops, but again, check out the link to the deck lists in the description. No, we'll also use a few cards that help us get lands out of our graveyard, just in case Slogurk can't do it for us. Now, in the $150 version of this deck, we'll use Life from the Loam. This is a sorcery that costs 1 and a green, and it lets you return up to 3 land cards from your graveyard to your hand. And it has Dredge 3, so you'll be able to keep reusing it over and over, as long as you don't mind a little self-mill. Now this is a commander staple in any deck that cares about lands and the graveyard at the same time, like Lord Windgrace or the Gitrog monster. It's also almost $15, but it's well worth the include if we can fit it into this deck. We'll also use Reminap Excavator, which is a budget version of Crucible of Worlds, but it costs slightly less mana, and it's on a much more vulnerable creature body. It lets you play lands from your graveyard, and that's really great for this deck. And of course there's Splendid Reclamation. This is a single-use effect. It's a 4-mana sorcery that says, return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Now for the $50 budget version of this deck, I couldn't find space for any of these, but we do have other options for land recursion. The Mending of Dominaria is a 5-mana saga. The first 2 chapters have you mill 2, and then you can return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So that's fine, you'll get a creature back, and you might mill a land to pump up Slogurk. And the 3rd chapter has you return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield, then shuffle your graveyard into your library. So it'll take a couple of turns to get all your lands back, but you weren't in a hurry anyways, right? Now there's also Scaretiller. This is a 4-mana 1/4 artifact creature. When it becomes tapped, you can choose to either put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, or return a land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So I like this versatility, but we don't have any way to tap Scaretiller in this deck, other than by attacking, so just be aware of that. But I really like that Scaretiller can help us play out lands that we've already recovered to our hand, maybe with Slogurk, or recover lands from the graveyard, depending on what we need. Okay, so now that we have our engine going, we have lots of valuable lands to sacrifice and recur with Slogurk, and we have ways to redeploy all those lands to the battlefield. So now let's go over some of the other cards that'll help this deck function. So we have a few support cards that are really awesome with Slogurk. You'll easily find these in a lot of Slogurk builds and on EDHREC, but they're so important that I'm going to mention them anyways. First, there's Sylvan Safekeeper. This is a 1-mana 1/1 that lets you sacrifice a land to give target creature Shroud until end of turn. You don't need to pay mana, you don't need to tap it. You just protect any creature from targeted removal if you want, or just sacrifice lands for free whenever you want. The Sylvan Safekeeper is awesome, but it's over $10, so this is definitely not part of the $50 budget version of this deck. There's also Zuranorb. This is an amazing 0-mana artifact. You can sacrifice a land to gain 2 life. Again, just free land sacrifice with no strings attached. No mana cost, no tapping, nothing. Every time I've drawn into Zuranorb, it has worked out really, really well for me. And then there's Constant Mists. This is a fog effect with buyback. It's a 2-mana instant that prevents all combat damage this turn, and you can buy it back by sacrificing a land. But again, this one hasn't been printed since like 1998 or something, so it's $5 to $10, and I couldn't include it in the $50 version of this deck. But we do have other ways to sacrifice lands in the $50 version, which we'll get to later. And with sacrifice outlets like these, Slogurk plays so much more differently than other Simic land decks. Again, you'll constantly be sacrificing your lands for value and then redeploying them, rather than just, vomiting 30 lands onto the battlefield by turn 8. So it's a lot of fun. Next I want to talk about some of the creatures. We have around 20 creatures in the $50 and $150 budget versions of this deck. Most of those creatures are for utility, but some can just help us smack our opponents in the face. Multani Yavimai's Avatar is hard to kill, and it's a giant beater with trample. It gets +1/+1 for each land you control, and each land in your graveyard. Obvious include. Centaur Vinecrusher gets +1/+1 for each land in a graveyard, and it can recur itself from your graveyard to your hand whenever a land is put into any graveyard from anywhere. So this is another resilient dumb beater. There's Scoot Swarm, a landfall staple, which will easily overrun your opponents with hundreds of copies of itself if left alone. Sadly, this card is around $5, so it wouldn't fit into the $50 budget version of this deck, but we'll play Rampaging Baloths instead, which is a decent substitute. Rampaging Baloths may not make as many tokens as Scoot Swarm does, but it makes 4/4s, so that's pretty good. There's Titania, Protector of Argoth, which gives you a 5/3 elemental creature whenever one of your lands goes to the graveyard from the battlefield, so obviously perfect for Slogurk. Ayula's Influence is an enchantment that lets us pitch lands from our hands to make 2/2 bear tokens. And Spitting Image is a sorcery that costs 6 mana, and it lets us make a token copy of any creature on the battlefield, and it also has Retrace, so you can cast it from your graveyard by discarding a land in addition to paying its mana cost. Now I also like Liege of the Tangle. This is a big, dumb 8 mana 8/8 with trample, but when it deals combat damage to a player, you can choose any number of lands you control and put an awakening counter on each of them. Each of those lands is an 8/8 elemental creature for as long as it has an awakening counter on it, so that's true even if Liege of the Tangle leaves the battlefield. And they're still lands. So again, this guy costs 8 mana, it has to hit someone to do anything, and we don't have anything in this deck that'll give it haste. But it's such a possible blowout that I've decided to include it anyway, and it's a lot of fun. Liege of the Tangle can literally turn all of your lands into permanent 8/8s just by hitting someone once. Or just some of your lands if you want. And because Slogurk has land recursion built in, you don't have to worry about someone casting a board wipe and erasing your mana base, because you can get those lands back. Well, okay, I would still worry about getting all of my lands destroyed, but you might not worry as much. Now when it comes to card draw, there are some great and unusual synergies with our commander. Remember that Slogurk cares about lands going to the graveyard, but it doesn't care how they got there, so we can sacrifice them or discard them or mill them. Excavation is a 2 mana enchantment that lets you pay 1 and sacrifice a land to draw a card. Actually, it lets any player do this, but most other players probably won't be in a good position to really take advantage of this. Trade Routes is another enchantment that lets you pay 1 and return a land to your hand, and you can pay 1 and discard a land to draw a card. Now Trade Routes is also over $5, so for the $50 deck instead, we'll use Soldevi Sage. This is a 2 mana 1/1 that you can tap and sacrifice 2 lands to draw 3 cards. Then you have to discard one of those cards. So each time you do this, you'll refill your hand and get 2+1/+1 counters on Slogurk. Windfall is the classic blue pseudo wheel effect. This will let you discard a bunch of lands at once and then refill with a fresh new hand. And Merfolk Looter is a simple 2 mana 1/1 that can tap to loot, or in other words you draw a card, then discard a card, which is probably a land. Fact or Fiction is already a commander staple, but if you get value from discarding lands, then your opponents will have an even harder time giving you an undesirable result with this card, so Fact or Fiction is great here. Now for ramp, we'll prioritize spells that let us sacrifice our lands, like Harrow and Roiling Regrowth. There's also Realms Uncharted, which is perfect for Slogurk. This is a 3 mana instant that lets you search your library for 4 land cards with different names. An opponent chooses 2 of them, and you put the chosen cards into your graveyard, and the rest into your hand. First, notice that Realms Uncharted can help us find any land, not just basic lands. Secondly, we'll get 2 of those cards to our hand, and 2 of them into the graveyard of an opponent's choice. But we can so easily recur land cards from our graveyard that it doesn't really matter how our opponents choose. We win either way. Unfortunately, Realms Uncharted is around $5, so you guessed it, our $50 budget deck had to cut this one. But instead, we'll use Tempt for Discovery, which probably isn't quite as good most of the time, but is a bit more fun. This is a 4 mana sorcerer that lets you search your library for a land card and put it onto the battlefield. Notice again, any land card, not just basic lands. Also, each opponent may search their library for a land card and put it onto the battlefield. For each opponent who searches their library this way, you get to search your library for a land card and put it onto the battlefield. So you'll get at least 1 land from Tempt with Discovery, and possibly up to 4 lands in a 4-player game. So again, cards like these are great since we have so many non-basic utility lands that we can abuse with our commander. And whether you build the $50 or the $150 version of Slogurk, you'll have access to 4 to 5 cards that you can use to tutor any land out of your deck, including non-basic lands. And finally, I want to mention some of our removal options. Because we're using several effects that turn our lands into creatures, we'll run a few board wipes that specifically hit non-land permanents. That way our opponent's creatures will be removed, but we'll still have those land creatures on the battlefield. Oblivion Stone is a 3 mana artifact that lets you pay 4 and tap it to put a fate counter on target permanent. You can also pay 5 and tap and sacrifice it to destroy each non-land permanent without a fate counter on it. There's Boompile, which is another artifact, because in Simic a lot of our board wipes are artifact based. It costs 4, and you can tap it and flip a coin. If you win, destroy all non-land permanents. Obviously the random nature of Boompile is a bit concerning, but it'll be fun. And again, it won't touch your land creatures. And then there's a lot of mass bounce spells that hit all non-land permanents. I've chosen to use Flood of Tears in this deck. This one costs 6 mana, it returns all non-land permanents to their owner's hands. And if 4 or more non-token permanents you control were returned to your hand this way, you get to put a permanent from your hand onto the battlefield. but there's lots of mass bounce spells in blue to choose from if there's another one you prefer. And that is Slogurk the Overslime. Let's go over the deck stats and cost. Alright, deck stats. This Slogurk the Overslime deck has an average mana value of 3.13 for the $50 budget version, and 2.96 for the $150 budget version. Both versions of this deck run 43 lands, though again only 42 of those tap for mana. The other one is Glacial Chasm, and this is a deck that cares about having lands, and having this many in the deck also helps ensure that we make our land drops each turn, which is nice. We have 10 to 11 land creature cards. These are either cards that can already become creatures, like Mishra's Factory, or cards that turn our lands into creatures, like Nissa Worldwaker. We have 12 cards that can help us play lands out of our hand faster. Some of these are single use, like Growth Spiral, and other ones are repeatable, like Skyshroud Ranger. I'm not counting cards that help us take lands out of our graveyard, like Ramunap Excavator, but we have 2 of those cards that, recover lands from our graveyards in the $50 build, and there are 3 of them in the $150 build, not counting our commander. We have 6 other sources of ramp in both decks. Now this sounds low, but first, I'm not counting cards that find land cards and don't actually put them onto the battlefield, like Expedition Map. I'm also not counting cards that can help us make additional land drops, but aren't guaranteed to do so, like Skyshroud Ranger. I mean, you should probably count those though, because often they will be mana ramp. But again, something like Skyshroud Ranger has a chance to not ramp you if you don't have cards in your hand, so I'm not sure whether to count it or not. Let's just say that we have at least 6 sources of ramp, but likely much more than that most of the time. We have 8 to 9 sources of card draw, and finally we have 8 pieces of single target removal and 3 board wipes. So that is Slogurk the Overslime. So I really want to stress again how much fun I had playing this deck. Yes, Slogurk is another Simic Lands Matter commander, which makes me feel kind of gross inside. And no, Slogurk is not very flexible when it comes to deck building as far as I'm aware. I mean, there's really only one effective way to build it. But it is a lot of fun. I really enjoy being able to sacrifice my lands for value, and because of our commander we can recover them from our graveyard and reuse them. But sacrificing your mana base is still a risk, and balancing that risk with the rewards that Slogurk provides, all of those landfall triggers, getting counters on our commanders so that it can punch in for more damage, and not to mention making sure that it has at least 3 counters on it all the time so it can bounce it back to your hand to protect itself. Balancing those rewards with the risks of sacrificing lands is a lot of fun. And again, this isn't a standard Simic ramp deck where you just ramp into more and more lands. Slogurk's lands are very dynamic. They'll constantly move around between the battlefield and your graveyard and your hand. Just be aware of graveyard hate, it will shut down a lot of what your deck wants to do. But anyways, I think that is all I've got for today. I'm still working on at least 1 to 2 more deck techs for Innistrad Midnight Hunt. I am working on builds for Florian Voldaren Scion and Lenore Autumn Sovereign. But certainly let me know in the comments if there are any commanders or mechanics you'd like to see made into a commander deck tech, especially an unconventional deck. But that is it for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.